Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. I have to say I was very honored to receive the invitation to present to such an esteemed group of researchers. So very happy to be here virtually. So my name is Will Orwig. I'm a fourth year PhD student working with Dan Schachter. And some of you may know Daniel Schachter's work is primarily with memory and future thinking. And I'm sort of extending that work about memory, episodic memory, towards creative thinking. So that's what I'll be talking about with you today. Of course, feel free to jump in with questions and I'll try to answer them as I go. I have about 40 minutes, 45 minutes prepared, so there should be plenty of time for questions. So the main question that guides a lot of my research is, how do we study the creative process and its neural underpinnings? So this is a question that I first stumbled upon as an undergraduate at University of Michigan, and I took this class about the psychology of creativity, which to me was just, I didn't know you could study something like creativity in a rigorous and scientific way. So that was when this first sparked my interest, trying to understand the psychometrics and actual methods for developing a science of creativity. And from that, also looking at the brain processes that support creative ideation. So just a bit of background on creativity theory. Generally, creativity is defined as the ability to produce ideas which are both novel and effective or useful. And this goes back to Teresa Amabile more than 30 years ago. The associative theory of creativity, which again has been around for more than 50 years, the associative theory essentially says that in order to come up with novel ideas, we recombine elements of semantic memory in novel ways. More to say on that in a second. So essentially, we have some network of semantic information, concepts that we are familiar with, and we recombine them or find associations between them, and that leads to the insight of a novel idea. Now, this memory in creative ideation is relatively new in the field. There's been a framework put forth that is this dual process model. So creativity involves two phases, a generation phase and an evaluation phase, and we oscillate back and forth between them in the process of generating and then selectively refining those ideas over time. And this framework was really nicely summarized by Matthias Benedek in this Nature Reviews Psychology paper, where they describe the ways in which episodic and semantic memory contribute to creative ideation across these discrete stages of the process. So I'll walk you through that now. So again, generation and evaluation are sort of these broad phases of creativity. And then within the generation phase, we have search for relevant knowledge or experience, and then a construction phase where we take bits and pieces of relevant information and we use them to generate some new idea. And then within the evaluation side, there are two criteria that we use to determine whether or not an idea is creative, those being novelty and effectiveness or utility to solve some problem. I'll also just say that there are other frameworks for creativity, like problem solving. Creativity has the ability to solve problems. In this talk, I'm just going to use this sort of framework because it gives us something to work from. Now, semantic memory, we might think, contributes to generation of ideas because it allows us to retrieve concepts from our memory or construct links between them. If we're evaluating whether or not an idea is novel or effective, we can compare it with our existing knowledge, and we can also assess certain properties of the idea just based on what we know about the world. Similarly, with episodic memory, we can use experiences of our past, or we can construct images of the future to determine whether or not some idea is novel, or particularly this last point about running simulations of the future. We could imagine a scenario where you're presented with a highly novel idea, and in order to determine whether or not the idea will be effective, we need to engage in some kind of episodic future thinking to simulate the outcomes. So some of my research has touched on all these different boxes, but what I'll be telling you about today is mostly about how semantic memory relates to the generation of creative ideas. So today's menu, I'll give you three sort of snippets of research. Firstly, I'll talk about how semantic distance captures individual differences in creativity. Next, I'll talk a little bit about creative experts and functional brain networks associated with these creative experts at rest. And I'll conclude with a brief summary of some work we've been working on related to HSAM, which is highly superior autobiographical memory, and whether or not these HSAM individuals have enhanced creative ability. So starting with study one, a bit of background. Some of you may already be familiar with this, but divergent thinking is sort of the dominant measure of creativity within laboratory settings. So in a divergent thinking task, you're asked to generate multiple ideas to open-ended problems. There's no single right answer. You're just given an open-ended prompt and asked to generate as many solutions as you can. And this is most typically measured with the alternative uses task, or the AUT, where I give you an object, let's say a brick, and I say, come up with as many uses, alternative uses for this brick as you can think of. Now, traditionally, in creativity literature, the performance on the AUT has relied on certain quantitative measures, such as the fluency, the number of ideas that you come up with, the flexibility, or the number of distinct categories of ideas that you come up with, and the elaboration. So those are all sort of quantitative measures of idea generation. There's this question about subjective creativity and just having raters in a lab score, from 1 to 5, how creative is this idea? And in some sense, that is the hardest to pin down or be precise about what we all agree is subjectively a creative use. But at the same time, it's really what we're after, because these other sort of metrics, these quantitative metrics, often fall short. And what we really care about is the qualitative creativity of a given idea. So that brings us to semantic distance, which provides an automatic and objective measure of conceptual similarity. So for example, in this sort of toy example, we have the concept red, and we could actually sort of map out how are different concepts associated with this concept of red. So other colors might be associated with it, fire engines or fire. And in this semantic space, the closer two concepts are to each other, the more conceptually similar they are. And the more semantically unrelated or conceptually dissimilar they are, the more distant they're represented in this network. And we can actually assess this based on the probability of two words co-occurring within a given text. And by using large corpus of text, we can quantify the semantic similarity and thus the semantic distance between any two words. Going back to the associative theory of creativity, that work has been followed up on by Yoed Kennett, among others. And the core idea is that the integration of semantically distant concepts leads to more creative ideas or more novel solutions. So if I'm able to connect red to some other word that is totally unrelated to red, but have it sort of construct some association that makes sense, that will lead to a more innovative solution. So in this study, we looked at the semantic distance of AUT responses. So given a brick, a participant comes up with some use for it, and we can compute the semantic distance between the prompt and the use that was generated. We also have human ratings of creativity. And what we found was that there's a high correlation between semantic distance between the prompt and response and human ratings of how subjectively creative that use was. And so this kind of fits in with the larger literature showing how semantic distance provides some kind of a metric for subjective creativity. Now, I will say that it sort of breaks down at a certain point, because if you come up with nonsense words or nonsensical responses to the AUT, that would score very highly on semantic distance, but it wouldn't actually receive a high rating of creativity. So it's not to say that this is capturing all of the variance with human ratings, but it certainly is a relevant metric when thinking about trying to quantify subjective creativity, at least within the context of the alternative uses task.
Will, we have a question here, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I had a question about this semantic distance. So I was considering the case in which, for example, your algorithm is randomly selecting words from a dictionary. And the semantic distance would be very high, but I guess that the human ratings would be very low, because it doesn't make any sense. And I guess that there should be some extra components to creativity, specifically here.
Yes, definitely. And so those sorts of responses would end up in this bottom right-hand quadrant, where it's like highly semantically distant and not at all creative. So there are definitely there are more factors that go into the subjective creativity of a response than just the semantic distance, for sure. What those are and like how we could tease them out, I think is a very open question, but this is at least a first, it's giving us some information about how people are assessing creativity. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for your question. So in this study, we were collaborating with Roger Beatty at Penn State University, and they collected these AUT responses, and they also had 155 participants, I think undergraduates at Penn State, go into the scanner. And so they completed the alternative uses task. We have their responses and the semantic distance and creativity of their AUT responses. And we also have resting state fMRI scans for these 150 or so individuals. So in the studies that I'll be presenting with you today, we have 5-minute resting state scans, and we were looking at functional connectivity or patterns of co-activation between voxels across the entire cortical surface. And I think many of you know that these bold signals are trying to capture fluctuations of bold signal over time, and we're trying to measure how these fluctuations synchronize. And when we talk about functional connectivity or coupling, the assumption is that there's some communication happening and that we're trying to capture patterns of co-activation or coupling between these individual voxels. From those, we can then construct brain graphs, which allow us to quantify or sort of represent these communication between brain areas. And the brain graphs provide a relatively simple way for us to model this connectivity and provide measures of connectivity across individual voxels. And just one point here, I'm sure many of you are familiar with functional connectivity methods, but one thing that makes this approach sort of unique is that it's done at the voxel level. So we're not looking at ROIs here. Each of the nodes in our brain graph, it represents an individual voxel within the whole brain. So graph theory has been around for many, many years, but recently it has sort of revolutionized network neuroscience. And graph theory is simply a branch of mathematics that uses nodes and edges to build networks. And there are many different types of graphs that we can build depending on what the nodes and edges represent. But in this case, each node represents an individual voxel, and the links between them or the edges between nodes represent the strength of connectivity between all pairs of voxels in the brain. So what we aim to capture by applying graph theory metrics in this context is some measure of centrality. So centrality is essentially a very fundamental property of graph theory, and it allows us to identify those voxels that are most prominent within the network. And so just as an example of this, degree would be the most simple measure of centrality, where we just count the number of links connecting each individual voxel to the rest of the network. And in this case, the voxel highlighted in yellow would have a degree of 5. Simple enough. Just to also clarify, we're cutting off, we have a threshold below which we would say 2 voxels are not synchronized, there's no functional connectivity, and we would not have any connection. So one step up from centrality or just degree would be weighted degree, where we sum the strength of connections between each voxel and the rest of the networks, the rest of the nodes in the network. And this provides a slightly more fine-grained measure of centrality. So in this study, we're looking at weighted degree to describe network connectivity associated with creative ability or performance on the alternative uses task. Just to summarize again these methods, we have participants come in, undergo resting state functional connectivity, from which we build these matrices. We assess the creative ability, both using semantic distance and human ratings of creativity. And then we build from these weighted degree networks, we're able to sort of compute statistics for how weighted degree of individual voxels tracks with performance measured via semantic distance or human ratings of creativity. So going to the results here, what we find is that both for semantic distance measures of creativity and human ratings of creativity, we find very similar patterns where there is reduced weighted degree connectivity within the visual cortex and some right lateral temporal areas associated with creative ability. Again, this is at resting state, so not when people are actively engaged in creative thinking, but during resting state, we see this pattern of reduced connectivity or reduced weighted degree within these areas at rest. Just to summarize, so semantic distance provides a measure of AUT responses that is both automatic and objective. We find reduced connectivity in visual cortex associated with creative performance, whether measured by SEMDIS or individual human raters. And one possible interpretation of these results is that during resting state, more creative people are attenuating their visual cortex or sort of tuning out from their primary sensory input, and that allows them to engage in some kind of internally directed cognition. Now, this is speculation, and I recognize that there are other alternative explanations of this, but what we wrote up in the paper was that one possibility is this idea of perceptual decoupling, and that was a term put forth by Jonathan Schooler back in 2011 in relation to mind wandering. So they argue that perceptual decoupling is sort of part of the process of internal cognition. And so maybe what we're picking up on here is that more creative people during resting state are sort of tuning out their visual input and engaging in internally directed cognition. Just one possible interpretation. So that concludes study 1. And then we sort of extended that work in study 2, looking at a cohort of creative experts. So we had a really great opportunity to collaborate with Megan Meyer and some colleagues at Dartmouth. And they did a huge amount of work to actually find this rare cohort of creative professionals that consisted of writers, actors, and directors. And they had a age and gender control sample that were people also sort of professionals in, I believe it was business, law, and medicine. So they found people of the same age and gender, looking at more creative professions and more traditional careers. They wrote up this paper in 2019 where they argue that creative experts engage in more vivid distal simulations compared to controls. And that was their main finding. They also collected resting state data, but there wasn't really the focus of their paper. So we reached out to them and we asked if they would be willing to share their data, which they were. So this sample was collected at Princeton Neuroscience Institute. We had 27 creative experts and 26 controls. They also completed the alternative uses task and 5-minute resting state scans. So we thought this was a cool opportunity to sort of extend our research and also use this maybe more ecologically valid criteria of whether someone was really creative or not. We used the same weighted degree methods as I described before, so exactly the same as study 1. We're just applying it to this group of creative versus controls. And rather than looking at creative performance as our DV, we're just looking at differences between the two groups and looking at differences in weighted degree connectivity at rest. So first, I'll show you the behavioral results. So this is looking at AUT performance on the x-axis. And what we see is that creative individuals, or people in the creative group, outperformed controls on the AUT. So that's providing some merit to our measure. We would hope that creative people do, in fact, perform better on a divergent thinking task, which we see that they do. And then looking at the brain data, comparing creative experts to controls, we again find this pattern of reduced weighted degree connectivity within the visual cortex. So we thought, oh, this is cool. We kind of get a replication. And we also didn't use the same measure, but rather we're just using this between group comparison, and we find the same pattern of results. So just to kind of briefly summarize, creative professionals outperform controls on a divergent thinking task. We replicate our findings of reduced connectivity in visual cortex related to higher creative performance or just belonging to the creative group. And this provides some additional support for our perceptual decoupling hypothesis. And I still am hesitant to say that this is definitely what's going on here, but it is consistent with some other literature about mind wandering and at least provides some suggestive evidence that during resting state, people are maybe disengaging from their immediate environment.
I will have another question here again, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So I have a question about this decoupling. So I was thinking about this connection from the external world, and as you mentioned, it makes sense for someone who tries to think about some ideas, specifically creative ideas. But then don't you expect to have similar reduction of activity in other sensory areas, like, for example, auditory cortex and the other part? Why it's just limited to visual cortex?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer is I don't really know. I don't have a good answer to that question. I would just say that, yeah, particularly for people who are like engaged in visual art, you might expect, okay, reduction of like visual cortex. But in this case, these experts are writers, actors, and directors. So I don't know, maybe one explanation could just be that we are so visually dominant. So like that's sort of our primary mode of sensory input, I guess. So when in the scanner, there's nothing really to see or look at, so you kind of space out. But yeah, I don't really have a good answer to that question. I think it's a very valid point.
Thank you. And another related question in visual cortex. So, for example, let's assume that there is an artist in the MRI, and when you ask the subject not to do anything, then maybe they start daydreaming. And if you are more creative, you start visualizing something. And I expected to see higher activity in visual cortex because of this kind of daydreaming or imagination or mental simulation.
Yeah, no, because there's a whole literature, right, about that sort of imagery and whether or not, even if you're just daydreaming and sort of thinking of visual imagery without any external input, that you could be engaging visual cortex.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So you might expect to find an inverse, the inverse effect, where increased connectivity to visual cortex. Very reasonable assumption. So another, just like to, I don't know if this necessarily answers that question, but another interpretation or way of understanding these findings, there was some discussion about repetition suppression, or so like maybe this reduction of weighted degree is like there's more efficient connectivity from visual cortex, and that therefore it's not that it's reduced, but that it's just more efficient, and there we get this sort of artifact of lower weighted degree connectivity. So I don't like playing this game of like trying to piece together the puzzle of why it's going on. I know that all of these studies are very sort of correlational, and we're not able to make any causal claims. So yeah, I hesitate to really stake our claim too heavily. I think it's at least consistent that we get these results across two studies. Why we get these results or what it necessarily means, still very much an open question. But yeah, no, I think you're raising really good points, and I don't have a satisfying answer, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yen, you have a question online?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, because initially you talked about like semantic memory being important for creativity, like linking concepts and stuff. So wouldn't you expect like more connectivity in ATL, like anterior temporal lobes? And then you kind of talk about looking inwards, but then wouldn't you expect more MPFC? So yes, that's just what I was wondering.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to that. There's definitely some work about semantic recombination and anterior temporal lobe. And there's also been a lot of work looking at when people are actively engaged in creative thinking, there's this sort of coupling between the default network and executive control network. And that's been well studied by Roger Beatty and others, where we find these like large scale networks that are typically working in opposition, and then during creative thinking, they're coupled.
I see.
In this study, we're looking at resting state. So it's not when people are actively thinking about creativity or recombining elements of semantic distance. So yeah, I think the semantic memory piece is more related to just our measure of semantic distance. And with the neural findings, it's less connected to that.
Yeah, fair. I see. Maybe with a task, you'd see activation there. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure. Good question.
Yeah.
One more question here.
I just wonder, you mentioned also functional connectivity as well. So have you tried, like what's the seed region that you tried? Have you tried different seed region? Or?
Yeah. Great question. So with this study, we haven't, but in study 3, we did do seed-based connectivity, and I'll explain that method as well. So you're kind of anticipating where I'm going next.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, so on to study 3. So here we were looking at highly superior autobiographical memory and its relevance to creativity. So just a brief summary, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with autobiographical memory, but essentially it is just one's recollection of personal experiences and events from one's life. And HSAM, or highly superior autobiographical memory, is characterized by the ability to vividly recall events from one's past. This was first reported by some work by Parker et al. in 2006, and they describe that individuals with HSAM describe it as an uncontrollable, exhausting ability to remember. So essentially, these people, starting around age 10, they remember every day of their life, and they can recall who they saw, what they did, or any notable events that happened. And it's really like kind of, I find it like mind-boggling that people actually have that excellent recall. And just to give you a bit of an intuition for this, I'll play a video clip. It's about 1 minute, and it provides a really nice demonstration of what these individuals have.
Enter James McGaugh, a professor of neurobiology at the University of California, Irvine, and a renowned expert on memory. Dr. McGaugh is the first to discover and study superior autobiographical memory, and he is quizzing Louise, his 5th subject, to find out. An eye condition requires him to wear a clouded lens.
Let's move back in time now to 1990. It rained on several days in January and February. Can you name the dates on which it rained?
Believe it or not, she could.
Let's see. It was slightly rainy and cloudy on January 14th, 15th. It was very hot the weekend of the 27th, 28th. No rain.
We checked the official weather records.
It rained very hard on Sunday, February 4th.
And she was right. McGaugh says this type of memory is completely new to science, so he and his colleagues have had to devise their own tests, like this one on public events.
October 19th, 1987.
It's a Monday. That was the day of the big stock market crash, and the cellist Jacqueline Dupre died that day.
The Berlin Wall falls on what day?
November 9th, 1989, which was a Thursday.
Christopher Reeve's accident occurred on what day?
It was Saturday, May 27th, 1995.
And when were the Oscars held in 1999?
In 1999, Sunday, March 21st.
Yes, perfect.
So when I see that, I'm just like, whoa, something is happening in these people that is extraordinary. And I don't know if we have a clear understanding of what it is that separates them from everybody else. So typically this HSAM begins around late childhood. So yeah, different individuals they've collected data from. There's some variability, but typically around late childhood. Unlike other forms of exceptional memory, like memory athletes, these HSAM individuals don't seem to use any deliberate mnemonic techniques. So they're not like going back to some sort of memory palace and retrieving information, but it's just right there, right away. Interestingly, their IQ is within normal range. And if you test them on other cognitive tasks, they perform just like normal controls. So it's just this very narrow ability to recall events from their own life. There's also been this, I don't know if I have it here now. There's been some work suggesting that there's this OCD hypothesis because some individuals with HSAM have OCD, and that sort of would suggest that maybe they're constantly rehearsing or recategorizing events and memories from their life, and that this sort of rehearsal is what allows them to be so exceptional with their autobiographical memory. But then the literature is mixed there because a lot of HSAM don't have any OCD and they still perform just as well. So again, there's some theories out there for what it is that separates them, but there's not a conclusive explanation for what's happening in HSAM. So given the potential role for memory in creativity, we thought, oh, well, maybe these HSAM individuals will outperform controls on a standard divergent thinking task, like the alternative uses task. And we might expect that because they have such good recall of their own memories, they would outperform controls on this divergent thinking task. Conversely, you might hypothesize, oh, well, because they have such a vast memory, that's going to actually inhibit them and prevent them from coming up with new creative uses. So maybe they're going to perform worse than controls. So we wanted to test this, and we had access to this cohort of HSAM through our collaborators at University of Sapienza in Rome. And what we find was that individuals with HSAM do not differ from controls in terms of their creativity. This is true for the alternative uses task and the remote associate task, which is another measure of convergent thinking. So across all these different measures, very, very consistently, they're just performing the same as controls. So it was a null finding, but I think still informative, because whatever it is that's enhanced in the memory of these HSAM individuals, it's not leading to greater creative ideation. Next, we thought about exploring the brain differences. So looking into a bit of the literature around previous neuroimaging research on HSAM. So past work has found that individuals with HSAM show increased patterns of connectivity within memory-related regions when they're remembering past events. And also resting state hippocampal connectivity was different in HSAM versus controls. So this work has been done and is sort of providing some evidence that HSAM have a different sort of neural circuitry than controls, especially when engaged in autobiographical memory tasks. But we sort of wanted to bring our resting state approach and explore more fine-grained details in terms of differences between HSAM and control at rest. So in this sample, it was collected at the Santa Lucia Foundation. We had 12 individuals within the HSAM cohort and controls that were matched for age and gender. 12 might seem like a small number, but within this rare cohort, it's actually quite good. And a lot of papers have been written with just a single HSAM individual. So we were quite glad to have at least 12 participants in our HSAM cohort. And they all had resting state fMRI scans, which we then used to look at weighted degree connectivity. Just as we did before, we looked at whole brain weighted degree as our sort of primary analysis. And then we additionally looked at seed-based connectivity, which was suggested there. And so seed-based connectivity essentially characterizes the patterns of connectivity from a predefined seed or region of interest. So in this case, we take a more hypothesis-driven approach where we define regions that we think are going to be relevant to memory, and then look from that seed, how does the connectivity between HSAMs and controls differ? And how do we define these seeds? Well, we went on to Neurosynth, which is a website with a huge corpus of it's like a meta-analysis of all these studies related to certain terms. And we conducted a search with the keyword autobiographical to extract these maps of voxels associated with autobiographical memory. And this was based on 143 studies included within the Neurosynth database. So this is a voxel-wise meta-analytic approach based on a bunch of different studies. And we use these 143 studies associated with autobiographical memory to identify 5 clusters relevant to autobiographical memory. And I'll just show you 3 of them here. So we have the posterior cingulate cortex, the medial temporal lobe, and the medial prefrontal cortex. And just to summarize this method in comparison to our weighted degree approach, so in blue, we can think of that being the weighted degree approach, where it's purely data-driven, whole brain connectivity, and we're not setting any a priori sort of hypotheses, and we're just letting the data speak. Conversely, the seed-based approach, we're specifying clusters of voxels that we think are related to autobiographical memory, and we're highlighting just differences in connectivity from those voxels to the rest of the brain. So the results now, when we look at the whole brain weighted degree differences at the group level, we find that HSAM individuals show increased weighted degree across wide swaths of cortex, particularly along cortical midline regions. Specifically, weighted degree of voxels within the medial prefrontal, anterior cingulate, and retrosplenial cortices were higher in HSAM relative to controls. Just to kind of pull out this effect or demonstrate this further, we take an individual voxel from the medial prefrontal cortex, and we're plotting here the weighted degree of that individual voxel across all these participants. And we can see by looking at this violin plot that the HSAM participants had a much higher weighted degree of that individual voxel. So nothing special about that one voxel. It's just more to show this effect and sort of visually demonstrate what we're finding here. So yeah, this was the first kind of main finding. And then we also looked at the seed-based connectivity from these three regions of interest. So first I'll show you from seed region A, which was the posterior cingulate cortex. We found higher connectivity in HSAM participants to the anterior cingulate, along with voxels in the medial prefrontal cortex. Again, sort of this pattern of increased connectivity from the PCC along these cortical midline regions in HSAM. Next, from the MTL, we observed higher weighted degree to voxels within the posterior cingulate cortex, parahippocampal regions. Furthermore, we observed reduced connectivity to the from the medial temporal lobe seed to supplementary motor areas, anterior cingulate cortex, and the anterior insula. And lastly, from the medial prefrontal cortex, we find higher connectivity to visual cortex, anterior cingulate cortex in HSAM participants relative to controls. And just to summarize these findings, again, here we describe brain network organization underlying this rare form of enhanced memory. And we highlight increased connectivity within midline cortical structures in a cohort of HSAM. We sort of, the integration of these memory-related regions using our seed-based analysis shows a sort of autobiographical memory network, which is enhanced or more connected in HSAM. And these results overall underscore the role of cortical midline structures supporting autobiographical memory. So going back to the creativity study, we don't find any differences, any meaningful differences in creative performance associated with HSAM. Nevertheless, we do find consistent patterns of neural differences at resting state in HSAM compared to controls. So a few takeaways here. Going back to study one, semantic distance as a measure of creative performance provides an automatic and objective assessment of creative thinking. We have identified patterns of reduced connectivity to the visual cortex in creative experts, as well as associated with individual differences in creative performance. And despite these alterations in brain connectivity at rest, HSAM individuals do not show any enhancement in their ability to think creatively. So whatever the memory that they have, which is enhanced, doesn't translate into more creative ideas. A few areas of future directions. So I've currently written another paper, a more behavioral study about creative writing and trying to quantify the features of text that relate to subjective ratings of creative quality. And here we're taking the idea of semantic distance rather than just looking at pairwise distance between two words. We're able to capture semantic diversity of an entire text. And so by writing short stories, we then have them rated in terms of their creative quality, and we can see that the semantic diversity of a story translates into higher ratings of creativity. So this is an area of ongoing research. Perhaps there will be some neural component at some point, but for now, it's just a behavioral study. As I mentioned at the beginning, we also have a keen interest in creative evaluation and how memory, particularly episodic retrieval and future simulation, relate to creative evaluation. I think this is an area generally in creativity which is underexplored because a lot of the research is focused on generation of creative ideas and trying to quantify performance as it relates to generative creativity, whereas the evaluative side is less explored. And I think there's a lot of really important work to be done to better develop our methods for creative evaluation. And lastly, this was a question that came up as I presented this HSAM work at CNS last year in Toronto, and several people were asking about the vividness of HSAM and in terms of their past memory and their future thinking. So if they're so good at remembering their past, are they also better able to imagine the future? And this obviously ties to my advisor, Dan Schachter's work about memory and future thinking. So I think there's an interesting question there as well about testing the limits of these HSAM individuals, not only in terms of their creativity, but in their ability to vividly remember the past and imagine the future. So these are a few areas of future and ongoing investigations. And with that, I would just like to thank all my collaborators on this work, particularly Dan Schachter, Jorge Sepulcre, who have been my mentors over the past year, and also Diana Tamir, Megan Meyer, Valerio Santangelo, who have been very generous to share data with us and sort of be excellent collaborators. So yeah, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you today, and I'm happy to answer questions. If you'd like to get in touch, you have my email and website, so please feel free to follow up with me if you would like to chat more or just have questions about this work.